G'day everyone. There's only been two occasions where I bought the same watch twice. One was a legendary Orient Bambino, and the other, just recently, is this. And like the Bambino, I did have a bit of remorse letting it go the first time because it was such a great dive watch for so little money. So let's do a double take and check out the SteelDive SD1970, which I'll now just refer to as a 1970. So here's a specs list of all the details, including physical dimensions, weight, water resistance, crystal, movement, and price. And as always on AliExpress, prices can fluctuate a fair bit based on seller, deals, coins, and coupons. And we may as well start with the obvious fact that the 1970 is, pretty much, a copy-paste version of an older Seiko model, the 6105, which has also been re-released as the SPB151J or Captain Willard. So if you don't mind the fact that this is a homage watch and then some, I think you'll be pleased with what it offers. The case dimensions look a bit bulky and wrist intimidating at first, thanks especially to that large curvature at the 4 o'clock position acting as crown guards, but the shorter lug-to-lug measurements make its wearability for average and even slightly smaller wrists a possibility. And thanks to the cushion-shaped case, the whole thing sits snugly on your wrist, like a cuddly block of steel. The lug-to-lug and diameter measurements also help compensate for the 1970's thickness. At a bit under 14mm, its height is a bit noticeable, but thanks to that case design, it never feels top-heavy or wobbly on the wrist. And while we're scoping out the case, the screw-down case back has a nice laser etching of the SteelDive logo in the middle, along with its specifications running around the circumference. Very informative and appropriate for a dive watch. Turning the watch over and checking out the dial, running around the outer edges are these tiny rectangular indices at every minute interval, with a slightly bolder rectangle at every 5-minute point. Sitting directly underneath them are the applied loomed indices at every hour point, save for the date complication at 3 o'clock, which I'll also mention is framed and large enough for people with 20/20 vision to check it without needing to squint, so it's well sized and has a touch of glass. Each indice is a squarish, rectangular shape with a good amount of presence. The 6 and 9 indices use larger rectangles, and the 12-point uses a pair of right trapezoid indices sitting side by side. In an ocean of dive watches that use circular markers, it's nice for a change to have one using 4-sided indices that have different shapes and sizes, and they help give a 1970 an interesting and assertive look. Keeping to that quadrilateral theme are the loom-filled silvery baton hands. They're just thick enough on the dial to be legible at a glance, but not so large that they overwhelm the dial and other features. And while I do prefer thicker hands, I think these were the right choice. Darting around the dial is a rather interesting seconds hand that uses a loom spear-tip shape to point out each second, along with a tiny red marker sitting just underneath it. Something else to draw your attention. Above the 6 indice you have the appropriately sized white text reading automatic, and just underneath with a pop of colour and symmetry is the red 200M text flanked by water and resist to its left and right respectively. And that's what I love about the 1970. On first glance it looks just like any other plain old diver with its black dial and ordinary looking bezel. But then you see that unusual case shape, and then you look closer and notice other elements. Those indices are quite bold and expressive. There's a bit of red splashed on the dial and jumping around with every passing second, and there's so much going on in that dial, but somehow it still looks coherent and tidy. The 1970 manages to offer a subdued look, but with a generous touch of personality. And being a dive watch, the 1970 comes with 200 meters of water resistance, so in theory you could be confident wearing this on a scuba outing, but in practice, rest assured that it will at least survive a shallow paddle in the water. The 120-click loom ceramic bezel works like a charm. The nailing has just enough grip to make turning this an easy experience, and the clicks sound rather nice and firm. There's a tiny bit of backplay going on, but to be honest its operation overall is noticeably better than my Seiko. At the time of purchasing my 1970 I couldn't get the black dial with bracelet, so I opted for this waffle strap instead. And I'm really glad I did because the strap is soft and the quality feels good in the hands and on the wrist. I don't have photo evidence, but based on my past experience with the 1970's bracelet, this strap is a much better choice. You can certainly get better aftermarket options, but as a freebie it's surprisingly good. And remember that its 20mm lug width, along with its uniform dive watch appearance, means you'll have heaps of strap options. The crown is signed and operating it while it's unscrewed to set the time and date is fairly straightforward. The date wheel clicks into place nicely, and the hands turn well, but they do feel rather light. And unscrewing the crown isn't too much hassle, but I found that rethreading it can be a problem, as the crown sometimes takes an extra push or two to reseat, and the rescrew process tends to take a bit of time. And those crown guards, while protective, can act as a bit of a hindrance in this process. And I guess those comments were my abrupt change to mixed feelings about the 1970, which leads me now to the loom. And to be fair, the 1970's loom is still impressive, especially as those hands and indices emit a constant glow during the day, even if their light exposure is limited. But what soured me a little is that with the first 1970 I owned, any surface that was loomed glowed like a beacon. But with my current example, it's obvious that they skimmed on the loom layers on the hands, and this becomes more obvious in my test here up against the Seiko. The indices and bezel are excellent, but those hands, the most crucial part for time telling, fade out quicker and don't last for distance. Overall they're still okay, but I know SteelDive can do and have done better. Going back to the case and its sides, I do love the smooth finish, but am wondering why they chose to use polished sides and a brush finish on top and underneath. The contrast isn't a big deal, but it would have been nice if they chose a theme and stuck with it. And given it's more of a tool watch, the brush finish all around would have been the better choice. And while the case feels weighty and sturdy, from an aesthetic standpoint it really looks and feels like a plain slab of steel. This doesn't impact the functionality or wearability of the 1970, but there's nothing in the way of finesse or detail. I know it's a small nitpick, but while the dial has a few finer details, the case is as utilitarian as it gets. And diving into negatives, a small one I'll add about the case are those lug ends and their sharpness. They're not as bad as some other watches I've handled, but they still have a keen edge nonetheless. And I've said it before and I'll say it again, the logo is another nitpick. I don't really care for it, and it's got too much presence under the 12 o'clock indice. It needs to be shrunk or changed altogether. So when you take all that's been said into account, it's obvious that the good outweighs the bad for the 1970. And when you consider that you can grab this piece for around $100 Australian, it makes ownership a reality for many. So with these points in mind, the 1970 is an easy recommendation to make to others if they're looking for a well-spec'd dive watch that's both sensible and a little bit different. Although if my experience is anything to go by, bear in mind that quality control is a thing when purchasing through AliExpress. Most of the time you'll get something great, and a few other times it might just be missing something. Just something to be aware of. But if you've owned or still wear a 1970, I'd like to hear your thoughts about it. And if you haven't done it yet, a like and subscribe always helps. But that's it for now, and thanks for watching, eh?